Paucas horas, o mundo muda para sempre. Io que pericia penis, mesum domingo ensolarado se transforma, pesadelo que atravesu oceanos. Destruiu ilusos, incendia o orgulho americano e fez o mundo inteiro tremer diante do rufer, distante motores metálicos vindos, do Pacifico. Naquila manha, de 7 de dezembro de 1941. O Attique Japões a Pearl Harbor se, inscrevi na historia neo apenas pela brutalidade e supressa, mas pela forma como, vira do avesso a política mundial, as estratégias militares e a vida de milhares de pessoas que jamais imaginarão, que acordariam com bombas explodindo, sirens wivando e avios cortando, o suem mergulhos mortais. E esse hoje alamos para trás buscando entender o que aconteceu. É impossível ignorar que, naquele momento, ninguém sabia o que estava por vir. Ninguém tinha antecipado o quando aquele ataque mudaria o curso da Segunda Guerra Mundial. Nem muito menos o quando marcaria a cultura, a memória e a própria identidade dos Estados Unidos. Porque tudo comica antes das bombas caram. Comica com rivalidades silenciosas, negociacos tensa, espionagem. Orgulho nacional e zadres geopolítico, que se desenrolava longe dos alhas, do cidadão comum. Zadres onde o Japão precisava de recursos. Petróleo e expanso territorial para sustentar SCU, Imperio Militar. E onde os Estados Unidos observavam com crescente preocupação os passos agressivos dos japoneses pela Asia, especialmente na China, e as ambicos marítimos que amicavam o equilíbrio militar no Pacífico. E enquanto diplomatas trocavam mensagens ambiguos, enquanto códigos eram interceptados e interpretados como atraso, enquanto o Japão simulava cooperação e diálogo, planos secretos já estavam em andamento. Comandantes calibravam seus esquadros. Submarinos se posicionavam silenciosamente no oceano e pilotos eram instruídos a executar uma operação ousada e arriscada, que se tornaria dos ataques mais estudados, debatidos e controversos da história militar moderna. E é fascinante imaginar o contraste entre as salas iluminadas por mapas estratégicos em Tokyo, onde o alto comando Japões trocava sua ofensiva com preciso que cirúrgica, e a atmosfera descontraída de Pearl Harbor, onde marinheiros passavam o tempo livre conversando, rindo, ouvindo música e escrevendo cartas para casa, acreditando que a guerra estava do outro lado do mundo, acreditando que nada de significativo aconteceria naquele domingo que parecia abençoado pela tranquilidade. E no Japão, havia uma convicção quase mística de que o único caminho para sua sobrevivência como potência era a expansão, e esse vazio nacionalista, militarista e imperial transforma o país em uma máquina de guerra altamente disciplinada, que admirava a eficiência, o sacrifício e a velocidade. E era isso que guiava o plano de ataque. Uma operação que exigia coordenação impecável entre porta-aviões, caca-zero, torpederos, bombarderos de mergulho e submarinos. Por outro lado, os Estados Unidos não acreditavam que o Japão usaria atacalos diretamente, muito menos em seu território, e muito menos em uma base naval tão importante quanto Pearl Harbor. Afinal, a distância era enorme. Os riscos eram gigantes, e a simples idea parecia absurda para muitos estrategistas americanos, que imaginavam que, se houvesse confronto, seria nas Filipinas ou algum ponto mais distante do Pacífico. Neo no coração do Havaí, e é justamente essa combinação de arrogância, subestimação e falha da interpretação diplomática que torna aquele ataque tão impressionante. Pois enquanto o presidente Roosevelt tentava conter o avanço Japões impondo embargos econômicos e bloqueios de petróleo, o Japão respondia com silêncio estratégico que mascarava o verdadeiro plano. Destruir a frota americana do Pacífico em único golpe, incapacitar sua capacidade de reação, e ganhar tempo suficiente para expandir seu domínio sobre o sudeste asiático antes que os EUA pudessem se reerguer. E quando a madrugada avançou, e a frota japonesa se aproximou silenciosamente das águas próximas a Pearl Harbor, veio a calma antes da tempestade, uma calmaria passada. Carregata de Destino, en cuanto marinheiros americanos dormiam suas camas, pilotos japoneses revisavam mentalmente sus alvos, e comandantes conferiam o relogio aguardando a hora exata de iniciar o ataque. Enteo, pouco antes das 8 horas de manhã, o silencio se rompu. Quando quais duas centenas de aviões japoneses surgiram no radar americano. Radar que, ironicamente, era recente pouco valorizado. O ponto de os operadores acreditaram que se tratava de exercício. Erro de leitura o u8 mesmo aviões americanos retornando do continente, e essa fala da interpretação custaria caro. Pois foi nesse intervalo de dúvida que o destino se salou. E enquanto o radar exhibia pontos brilhantes, pilotos japoneses gritavam palavras de motivação, ajustavam suas máscaras e preparavam bombas capazes de atravessar o casco de navios enormes como o USS Arizona, e de repente, o sobre Pearl Harbor se encheu de sombras rápidas, asas prateadas e motores estridentes, e quando os primeiros aviões mergulharam na Dorico de base, como o sol refletindo suas fuselagens, como o chaos. As bombas começaram a cair, os torpedos começaram a correr pela água Dorico aos navios ancorados. E o que era paz se convertiu gritos, fogo, fumaça negra e explosos que sacudiam o solo. Marinheiros acordaram atordoados, correndo pelos corredores inundados de fumaça, tentando entender o que estava acontecendo, vendo colegas feridos, ouvindo o som surdo de metal sendo rasgado por explosos, e muitos secretivam tempo de reagir antes que os torpedeiros japoneses acertassem caio navios gigantes como o USS Oklahoma, que vira de lado questo de minutos, prendendo centenas de homens SCU interior, transformando compartimentos camaras escuras onde sobreviventes batalham desesperadamente nas placas metálicas, esperando resgate enquanto a água subia e o oxigênio desaparecia. E enquanto o USS Arizona explodia violentamente após surdo Dorito no depósito de Múnicos, levantando uma cortina de fogo e fumaça que podia ser vista de longe, pilotos japoneses retornavam para atacar pela segunda onda, mirando pistas de pouso, hangars, depósitos de combustível e aviões no solo, impedindo decolagens, destruindo defesas e garantindo que a surpresa fosse completa. E entre tudo isso havia histórias individuais de coragem, desespero e sobrevivência que raramente aparecem nos livros, como a de pilotos americanos que conseguiram decolar mesmo sob ataque, ou de operadores antiaéreos que dispararam o último segundo, ou de civis que correram para socorrer feridos, sem sequer entender plenamente quem estava atacando e por quê. E enquanto esse inferno consumia Pearl Harbor, radios americanos comunicavam a transmitir mensagens urgentes, e famílias diferentes estados ouviam com espanto, medo e incredulidade que os japoneses tinham atacado, que navios estavam afundando, que o país estava sob ataque. Esse choque psicológico foi tão devastador quanto as bombas, pois destruiu a sensação de segurança que os americanos tinham desde o fim da Primeira Guerra Mundial. Uma sensação de que o Oceano Pacífico era escudo natural que os mantinha longe do caos global. Mas naquele domingo essa ilusão se despedicou, e as consequências desse ataque não se limitaram ao campo de batalha. Elas ecoaram pelos corredores de política, pelos discursos, pelos jornais e pelas casas mais humildes do interior. Pois naquele mesmo dia as pessoas entendiam que o mundo que conheciam não existia mais. And while smoke still rose from the twisted wreckage and the eyes of the world turned toward the Pacific, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was being briefed with growing gravity about the scale of the attack, about the ships hit, the planes destroyed, and the still uncertain number of dead and wounded. And from that moment on the gears began to turn that would transform the attack on Pearl Harbor into a historical, political, and cultural turning point, because the news spread across the continent like fire through dry straw, moving through radios, newspapers, military transmissions, and whispered conversations between neighbors, causing an impact that no one at that moment could fully measure. And while soldiers and nurses worked at Pearl Harbor among debris and charred bodies, trying to rescue survivors, the country suddenly found itself facing a question that until then had seemed distant. How do you respond to an act of war so unexpected? For until that Sunday, many Americans still held a strong isolationist sentiment, believing that the war consuming Europe and devastating Asia was a distant problem, a conflict between nations that did not concern the everyday citizen of the United States, who focused on daily life, work, family, and domestic tranquility. But all of that was crushed within a few hours, and people began to fill churches, hospitals, military posts, and police stations, looking for information, offering help, spreading rumors, and trying to process what seemed impossible. The greatest attack suffered on American soil since the Civil War, an affront that shook not only geopolitics but national pride. And at the same time, on the other side of the world, Japan experienced the euphoria of a plan executed with precision, military leaders displaying maps, statistics, and reports to Emperor Hirohito, celebrating the destruction of much of the Pacific Fleet and believing they had secured a decisive advantage to expand their dominance over Southeast Asia without American interference, while pilots returned to their carriers with a sense of mission accomplished, often unaware of the human impact of what they had caused, because for them, as for many soldiers around the world, war was not personal, it was duty, an idea steeped in patriotism, honor, and orders. And that emotional distance between those who execute and those who suffer the attack is one of the most tragic elements of history. And the next day in Washington, Roosevelt rose before Congress to deliver a speech that would echo through eternity, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy, and his words resonated with an almost biblical force, pushing the country into war and awakening a collective fury that had seemed dormant until then. For in that instant the United States ceased to be merely an observer and became a decisive actor in the Second World War, and the attack on Pearl Harbor provoked an almost immediate political reaction, with declarations of war against Japan and, soon after, against Germany and Italy, because Axis alliances demanded that domino effect. And suddenly what had been a regional conflict became a truly interconnected global war, with simultaneous fronts in the Pacific, Europe, and North Africa. And while speeches ignited Congress, young men volunteered for service, lines formed at recruitment offices, civilian factories began to be converted into military production. Lines and women previously kept away from heavy industrial work became a vital part of the war effort, creating a new social phenomenon that would forever change labor dynamics and family relations in America. Because Pearl Harbor did not only transform military strategies, it transformed society. And when we look into the attack itself, it is worth remembering that it lasted only a few hours, but its consequences stretched over years, because it was not only the material destruction that weighed, though that was immense, with sunken ships, destroyed hangars, hundreds of planes rendered useless, and nearly 3,000 dead, but also the symbolic destruction, the shattering of Americans' historical confidence in their own invulnerability, a psychological wound that would reverberate through books, films, memories, and speeches. And in the military sphere, Pearl Harbor triggered a complete reconfiguration of naval warfare, because many powers still believed that great battleships represented the pinnacle of maritime power. But the attack showed the world that those who would truly command the oceans were the aircraft carriers and their air wings, opening the path to legendary battles, such as Midway and Guadalcanal. And that strategic revolution would change not only the course of the war, but military planning for decades. Because after Pearl Harbor, countries began to understand that the future of war lay in the air, in the ability to reach the enemy before they could react. And that would shape the entire rest of the 20th century. But beyond technical and political analysis, there is the human side, the one that rarely appears with depth, that lives in the accounts of survivors. Sailors who woke up inside flooded compartments, soldiers who ran barefoot under fire to man anti-aircraft guns, pilots who tried to take off from bombed runways, nurses who worked until they collapsed trying to save lives, and civilians who watched from the shoreline the giant explosion of the USS Arizona without knowing if what they were seeing was real or a nightmare. And as this echoed along the West Coast, children in schools practiced blackout drills. Entire cities turned off their lights fearing bombings. Residents dug underground shelters. and newspapers printed headlines about the Japanese threat, creating a climate of paranoia that would lead to one of the darkest episodes of American politics. The internment of more than 100,000 Japanese Americans in confinement camps within the United States, an action based on fear, ignorance, and widespread suspicion, which decades later would be officially recognized as a grave mistake and a violation of civil rights, but which in that moment was seen by many as necessary to protect the country. And this is yet another collateral effect of Pearl Harbor that seldom enters the heroic narrative, because wars have winners, losers, and scars, and not all of them are visible. And as we build this timeline, it becomes impossible to ignore that Pearl Harbor also changed Japan, which at that moment believed it had achieved a historic victory, ignoring that the attack had awakened an industrial giant capable of producing thousands of aircraft, ships, and weapons at staggering speed, ignoring that it had provoked an enemy that would not retreat until total surrender. And this strategic blindness shows how pride and military haste can cloud the vision of leaders who see only the immediate present without considering the weight of the future. And it is fascinating to imagine what went through the minds of Japanese pilots who, upon returning to the carriers after the attack, celebrated their mission unaware that many of them would never return from future battles, and that Sunday, which for them represented glory, would be remembered by the rest of the world as terror, betrayal, and tragedy. And history moves on, and the deeper we go, the more we understand that Pearl Harbor is not merely a military event. It is a turning point in modern history, where diplomacy, strategy, technology, ideology, and human lives collided on a single day, altering the map of the planet and establishing the path that would lead not only to the defeat of the Axis, but to the rise of the nuclear age, the Cold War, the emergence of the United States as a superpower, and the world we know today. And as we move through this narrative that stretches far beyond bombs and explosions, we realize that Pearl Harbor represents one of those rare moments in which time seems to split in two, before and after. Because before December 7th, 1941, there still existed a world built on the belief that geographical distances were safe barriers. A world where most Americans believed that the Pacific Ocean was a natural wall guaranteeing their peace. A world in which war seemed like a distant spectacle, broadcast through radios, described in newspapers, and interpreted by commentators who spoke about battles in Europe as if they were discussing historical events that would never reach the streets of Los Angeles, Chicago, or New York. But after that Sunday, all of that vanished. And in its place emerged a country that understood that war was real, that it could arrive without warning, that it could destroy ships on the American coast, that it could transform a cheerful and sunny harbor into a scene of ashes, smoke, and twisted metal. And this cultural shock shaped behaviors, opinions, and political discourse, because Pearl Harbor acted as a catalyst that unified an entire country under one flag and one cause, something American leaders had been unsuccessfully attempting since the beginning of the war in Europe. And when we observe the scale of the attack, we see that Japanese military genius was not only in the precision of their targets, but in the preparation that required months of study and technological adaptation. Because the torpedoes used in Pearl Harbor were not ordinary torpedoes. They were torpedoes modified with special devices that prevented them from sinking too deep, since Pearl Harbor's waters were shallow. And this shows how the attack was much more than a lucky strike. It was engineering, espionage, intelligence, and tactical daring. And while Japan calculated every detail, the United States believed that the greatest risk was in the Philippines, ignoring clues that appeared in reports, intercepted communications, and diplomatic warnings. And when we speak of intelligence failures, Pearl Harbor becomes almost a case study, because there were fragmented pieces of information that, if interpreted together, could have alerted American military authorities, from diplomatic warnings to partially decrypted messages. But bureaucracy, arrogance, and the underestimation of the enemy created a curtain of inattention that was violently torn apart the moment the first Japanese bombers appeared on radar. And the brutal truth is that not all mistakes were at the top of the command chain, because on that very Sunday the first indications of the attack were dismissed as training exercises, which reveals a human trait that spans centuries of military history, the tendency to ignore warnings when they seem too unlikely to be true. And history is full of such examples. where the signs were there, but no one believed them. And while chaos consumed Pearl Harbor, individual lives collapsed and transformed into stories that would survive for decades, like that of Joseph George, a sailor who saved lives without immediate recognition, or that of Dory Miller, an African-American cook who, despite having no training to operate anti-aircraft weapons, took control of a gun and fired at Japanese planes, becoming a symbol of courage and resilience in a country where racial segregation was still a concrete reality. And these examples show how wars are not made only of admirals, generals, and strategies, but of ordinary men and women who, when faced with death, found strength they didn't even know they possessed. And while we speak of courage, it is also important to speak of fear, because survivor accounts describe something beyond physical terror. They describe a sense of absurdity, of disbelief, of watching a sky filled with aircraft bearing Japanese insignia flying over Hawaii, something no one ever imagined witnessing. And this psychological shock reverberated along the entire west coast of the United States, where residents spent weeks believing that the next wave of attacks could hit San Francisco, Los Angeles, or Seattle. And it was this fear that fed the paranoia that culminated in the imprisonment of thousands of Japanese Americans in internment camps, once again showing that wars are not confined to the front lines. They spill into homes, policies, and consciences. And while all of this was unfolding in the United States, Japan continued expanding its dominance across the Pacific, capturing territories, advancing into the Philippines, and believing it had enough time to consolidate its empire. But what Hirohito and his advisors may not have anticipated was the speed with which the American giant could rise. Because just months after the attack, U.S. factories were already producing tanks, aircraft, and warships on a scale never before seen in human history, driven by an industrial machine that transformed a peaceful nation into a colossal war power. And this would become one of the decisive factors in the outcome of the Second World War. And while we admire American industrial capacity, we must also recognize that the attack triggered a very particular emotional mobilization, because young men from every region, social class, and ethnic background volunteered for service. And unlike World War I, which had faced resistance and unpopularity, the entry into World War II after Pearl Harbor was met with unity and public support. And that made all the difference, because wars are not won by weapons alone, but by morale, unity, and national purpose. And as we follow this historical thread, we realize that Pearl Harbor planted the seed for numerous future decisions, some monumental and others catastrophic, such as the development and use of nuclear weapons just a few years later. Because without the attack, American involvement might have been slower, less aggressive, and possibly less committed. And many historians argue that without Pearl Harbor, the United States might never have become the superpower that shaped the 20th century, reinforcing the idea that a single event can permanently redraw the world. And the deeper we examine it, the more we understand that Pearl Harbor is not merely a battle, but a symbol. And symbols carry meanings that transcend facts, meanings that are interpreted, retold, and repurposed over time. And that is why the attack lives on in American culture through films, documentaries, museums, and annual ceremonies, because it represents not only tragedy, but transformation, a wound that became a banner, a defeat that propelled a greater victory. And we cannot forget that as all of this unfolded, survivor accounts were being recorded. Families received telegrams informing them of the deaths of loved ones. Newspapers printed shocking photographs, and the world watched in astonishment. Because if there had been any doubt about the role of the United States in the war, Pearl Harbor destroyed it. And the Axis knew they had provoked an adversary with virtually unlimited resources, while the Allies knew they had just gained a partner capable of changing the course of history. And from this point forward would come massive battles, such as Midway, where aircraft carriers and planes would decide the fate of the Pacific, and Guadalcanal, where brutal close quarters combat in the jungles revealed the human cost of the conflict. But each of those battles existed only because Pearl Harbor opened the door, forced decisions, and placed the United States onto the global stage. And in the next segments of this narrative, we will dive into these consequences, military, political, social, and human. Because Pearl Harbor does not end with the bombs. It begins with them, and the impact they unleashed would continue to expand like ripples across a lake until they reached the entire planet. And when we look at the trail left by those historical waves, we see that war after Pearl Harbor takes on a new meaning for the United States and for the world, because it ceases to be a conflict centered on Europe and becomes truly global, involving oceans, continents, cultures, and ideologies, and this geopolitical expansion transforms not only the battlefield, but international relations, diplomatic agreements, intelligence strategies, and even the global economy, since propelled by the Japanese attack, the U.S. Congress approved colossal investments in the military-industrial complex, and American society began to watch factories once dedicated to household appliances, automobiles, and consumer goods convert into assembly lines for Sherman tanks, P-51 fighters, and B-17 bombers. And this wartime industrial revolution not only strengthened the Allies, but established the economic blueprint that would define the 20th century, with major corporations tied to the defense sector, scientific research institutes, secret laboratories, and universities mobilized to develop technologies capable of winning the conflict. And within this technological crucible emerged everything from advanced radar systems to the largest scientific project in history at the time, the Manhattan Project, whose creation of the atomic bomb, first detonated in 1945, has strategic roots that trace directly back to the trauma, fear, and sense of urgency awakened by Pearl Harbor. But before reaching that final and tragic point of the war, it is necessary to understand how Japan itself viewed what it had done, because within Japanese headquarters after the attack, the initial feeling was one of absolute victory, since the American Pacific Fleet had been crushed, ships lay submerged, aircraft destroyed, and a significant portion of American infrastructure temporarily disabled. And for many Japanese commanders, this seemed like the ideal moment to press the enemy even harder, exploiting the psychological shock to force negotiations or expand territory before the United States could recover. But this view ignored something fundamental: American industrial and emotional resilience. And history shows that instead of weakening the nation's spirit, the attack unified it, turning anger into machinery and outrage into ammunition. And even more striking is the realization that the same population that weeks earlier rejected the idea of entering the war now volunteered in massive numbers, while newspapers, radio broadcasts, and cinema spread patriotic messages that shaped a collective imagination of sacrifice, heroism, and moral mission, forging a rare national consensus that perhaps no speech or political campaign could ever have achieved. And while this mobilization unfolded on the home front, the situation in the Pacific Theater grew increasingly tense, because days after Pearl Harbor, Japan launched a wave of coordinated offensives, advancing into Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaya, Burma, Guam, Wake Island, and especially the Philippines, which at the time were under American control, and the fall of the Philippines became one of the most painful and humiliating defeats for the United States, marked by the infamous Bataan Death March, during which tens of thousands of American and Filipino soldiers were forced to march under extreme heat, hunger, disease, and brutal beatings, resulting in thousands of deaths and cementing a cruel image of the Imperial Japanese Army in the eyes of the Western public. And while this advance appeared unstoppable, something moved quietly within American strategy: the realization that it would be necessary to strike Japan at its core, not only as symbolic retaliation, but to shatter the aura of invincibility that had surrounded the empire after Pearl Harbor. And from this resolve emerged the daring and near-suicidal Doolittle Raid, when in April 1942 B-25 bombers launched from an aircraft carrier, something previously thought impossible, attacked Tokyo and other Japanese cities, causing limited material damage, but delivering a devastating psychological blow to Japanese morale while lifting American spirits, proving that the empire was not untouchable. And this raid, though small, triggered strategic consequences that would alter the course of the war, because it pushed the Japanese high command to accelerate plans that would culminate in the Battle of Midway, an event that emerged directly from Pearl Harbor as the true military turning point of the Pacific. And here we see how the pieces of war connect in a chain. Pearl Harbor triggers American entry into the war, which triggers industrial mobilization, which enables the Doolittle Raid, which enrages and destabilizes Japanese leadership, which accelerates Midway, which destroys the backbone of the Japanese Navy. And all of this because a single initial attack redefined the parameters of the conflict. But before diving into Midway, it is important to return to the emotional impact, because Pearl Harbor also reshaped another dimension of American society, culture, and the collective memory of the attack was transformed over decades into monuments, films, books, speeches, and rituals that preserve not only pain, but identity, because nations build their historical narratives through symbols. And Pearl Harbor is one of the greatest symbols in the United States, representing both vulnerability and response, both tragedy and resilience. And this symbolic transformation also occurs in Japan, which after the attack and after the war was forced to reinterpret its own history, its militarization, and its nationalism, understanding that although Pearl Harbor was initially celebrated internally as a triumph, it later became a historical wound marking the beginning of the empire's collapse, culminating in the surrender of 1945 and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But while these long-term consequences were being woven into destiny, the survivors of Pearl Harbor continued to live with deep trauma, because those who were there did not merely see bombs falling. They saw bodies burning, ships sinking with men trapped in flooded compartments, muffled screams inside steel hulls, and explosions so violent that they hurled automobile-sized chunks of steel from the water. Horrors etched as psychological scars that many carried for the rest of their lives. And in interviews decades later, many survivors described visions that haunted their sleep, nightmares of comrades submerged, pounding on metal walls begging for help, the stench of burning fuel, the piercing sound of sirens they could never forget. And this is the human side that almost always disappears when Pearl Harbor is reduced to dates and numbers. And while these men carried their trauma, younger generations grew up in the years that followed hearing stories about the attack, about the day the world changed, about the day that forced the United States to fight not only to defend its territory, but to redefine the global balance of power. And this historical weight translated into films and heroic narratives that shaped American culture throughout the 20th century. Which is why even today, more than 80 years later, Pearl Harbor is not seen as a distant event, but as a milestone, because it not only initiated the largest military mobilization in U.S. history, but established the nation as a global superpower and inaugurated the geopolitical landscape that would dominate the decades that followed, culminating in the Cold War and the modern world. And as we move toward the next battles, political decisions, trials, and post-war agreements, Pearl Harbor remains the root, the origin, the trigger that transformed the 20th century. And that is why revisiting that Sunday means revisiting not just an attack, but the birth of an era. And when we understand Pearl Harbor as the birth of an era, it becomes impossible to separate the attack from its broader consequences. Because if we look at the geopolitical chessboard immediately before December 7, 1941, we see a fragmented world, with Europe in flames under Nazi domination, the Soviet Union fighting for its survival after Operation Barbarossa, the United Kingdom exhausted by years of bombing, and in Asia already suffering Japanese military expansion since the 1930s. But when we look at the board after Pearl Harbor, we find a completely different game, with the United States as an active piece, armed with vast industrial resources, global logistical capacity, and a moral narrative that framed the war not merely as a strategic necessity, but as a civilizational mission against totalitarian regimes. And that changes everything, because when an industrial and financial power like the United States goes into motion, the entire world reorganizes around that movement. And that is exactly what happens in the years that follow, with convoys crossing the Atlantic to supply Britain, troops landing in North Africa, German submarines attempting to sever supply lines, air battles raging over Europe, and, of course, American forces fighting to reclaim island after island in the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, each victory costing countless lives, but bringing the end of the war closer. However, before crossing the ocean toward the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, we must still complete the arc that begins at Pearl Harbor and culminates at Midway, because the Battle of Midway, fought in June 1942, just 6 months after the attack on Hawaii, is considered by many historians to be the true turning point of the Pacific War, due to strategic, technological, and even psychological factors, because when planning Midway, Japan sought to repeat what it had done at Pearl Harbor: destroy the American fleet, crush morale, and consolidate dominance. But The context had changed, because by then the United States had partially broken Japanese naval codes, meaning American forces knew where and when the attack would occur, and that single fact altered the balance of the war, because information in wartime is as valuable as tanks, guns, and aircraft carriers. And by anticipating the attack, the Americans positioned their carriers, launched aircraft at the right moment, and managed to sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, that were a vital part of the same force that had devastated Pearl Harbor months earlier. And this loss was catastrophic for Japan, because unlike the United States, which possessed a vast industrial base, Japan could not replace those carriers at the necessary speed, and thus, in a single battle, the Imperial Navy lost the core of its offensive capability in the Pacific, along with many highly experienced pilots trained over years, and Japanese aviation would never again reach the same level of tactical excellence. But what makes Midway even more fascinating is its psychological connection to Pearl Harbor, because while the December 7th attack was seen by Japan as a strategic triumph, Midway marked the beginning of its decline, and both events unfolded in the same theater, involving the same protagonists, showing how war is shaped by surges and reversals, by victories that turn into defeats, and by decisions that seem brilliant in the moment but reveal devastating consequences over time. And while Japan absorbed the shock of Midway, the United States consolidated something even more powerful, the belief that victory was possible. And that belief is essential in any war, because wars are not won by machines alone, but by morale, confidence, and narrative. And after Midway, the narrative shifted. Newspapers spoke of counteroffensives, of achievable victory, of historical justice. And this transformation reshaped the national mood. And as these events unfolded, Roosevelt and his inner circle were watching not only the Pacific, but the global picture, forming alongside Churchill and Stalin an unlikely alliance that placed liberal democracies and an authoritarian communist regime side by side, united not by political affinity, but by a common enemy. And this alliance, known as the Big Three, would define the post-war world. But it would never have existed without Pearl Harbor, because without the attack, the United States might not have entered the conflict in a decisive way, and without the United States, the United Kingdom might not have withstood the Wehrmacht, and without that resistance, the Soviet Union might have been defeated by the Nazis. And this chain of consequences leads us to the realization that Pearl Harbor did not transform only the Pacific, but may have saved Europe from a completely different future. And from this point, it becomes clear that when we speak of a day that shocked the world, we're talking about a day that quite literally reconfigured the world. Yet while we look at strategic maps, speeches, and battles, we cannot forget that everyday life in the United States was also transformed. Because on the radio, families listened to announcements about rationing, conscription, and the need to buy war bonds. And in the streets, women took on jobs previously reserved for men, operating heavy machinery, driving trucks, working in ammunition plants and aircraft factories. And this social phenomenon gave rise to an iconic figure, Rosie the Riveter, the symbol of a woman in a bandana operating a rivet gun, representing the idea that we can do it. And this was not merely propaganda. It was concrete social transformation, because by the end of the war, millions of women were already integrated into industry. And although many were pressured to return to the home in the post-war years, the seed of change had been planted, and decades later it would blossom into movements for women's rights, revealing once again that Pearl Harbor generated waves that went far beyond the military sphere. However, not every domestic transformation was positive, because the same climate of fear that unified the country also legitimized one of the darkest acts of American domestic policy: the arrest and forced internment of more than 110,000 Japanese Americans, many of them U.S.-born citizens, who were removed from their homes, separated from their families, forced to sell their property, and sent to confinement camps inland, all with presidential approval and congressional support. And although this policy was defended as a national security measure, today it is recognized as a grave violation of civil rights, showing how panic and war can distort democratic principles. And it is important to bring this element to the center of the narrative, because it reminds us that external tragedies often trigger internal injustices, and Pearl Harbor contains both. And while all of this unfolded in the United States, Japan was also undergoing profound internal transformations, because even as the government and high command celebrated initial victories, the population felt the weight of rationing, family losses, and the psychological strain caused by bombings and overtime. As the United States advanced across the Pacific and intensified aerial attacks, Japanese cities would begin to be destroyed by incendiary bombs, culminating in infernal scenes such as Tokyo in March 1945, when the bombing killed more civilians than in some German cities, and even more than Hiroshima in its initial impact, revealing another side of the war that is often overshadowed by major strategic events. And when we finally arrive at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the final chapters of this journey, we realize how Pearl Harbor did not merely start a conflict, but opened the gate to the nuclear age, because the Manhattan Project was born from the conviction that only a weapon of absolute power could force Japan's surrender. And this conviction is inseparable from the trauma of Pearl Harbor, because if the 1941 attack had not occurred, there might not have been such urgency to develop the atomic bomb, there might not have been the funding, there might not have been the political justification, and thus, when the white light consumed Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and then Nagasaki on August 9th, we can trace a direct line that begins with Japanese bombs falling on Hawaii and ends with American bombs falling on Japan. And it is a line that cuts across the century with enormous moral weight, because there the war did not merely end, another era began. The atomic age, the Cold War, the permanent nuclear threat, the reorganization of the international system, and the rise of the United States as a superpower. And when Japan finally surrendered on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, the historical circle closed, because the surrender took place on a ship named after an American state, a perfect symbol to end the war that began at Pearl Harbor. And by observing this cycle, we can grasp the magnitude of the original event. An aerial attack lasting only a few hours that triggered for years of total war, millions of deaths, social transformations, and the very redefinition of global power. And after the war, Pearl Harbor became memory, and memory became monument, such as the USS Arizona Memorial, where tourists and veterans gather to observe the sunken ship still resting on the ocean floor. And there, silently, drops of oil continue to seep out, often symbolized as the ship's tears and those of its men. And this symbol is powerful because it reminds us that history does not disappear. It remains submerged, visible only to those who choose to look. And, at the end of this journey, traveling from that sunny Sunday to the surrender in Tokyo, from ignored radar warnings to the nuclear flash over Hiroshima, from the shipyards of Honolulu to the strategic maps of Washington and Tokyo, it becomes evident that Pearl Harbor is not merely a military event, but an episode that crossed the 20th century as a historical axis, defining who would command the world, how wars would be fought, and how societies would be reorganized. And that is why when we say it was the day that shocked the world, we are saying very little, because in truth, it was the day that reconfigured the world, and the waves of that shock continue to ripple to this day. And after the initial impact, when the roar of Japanese engines had vanished beyond the horizon and the harbor was still smoldering like an open furnace, the question hanging in the air was not only how did this happen, but above all, what now? Because Pearl Harbor was not merely an attack. It was a turning point that pushed the planet toward an irreversible transformation, and the consequences began immediately, almost like a chain reaction. The United States declared war on Japan the very next day, and only a few days later Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, permanently binding the three great theaters of the conflict, Europe, Africa, and the Pacific, into a single truly global war, something that even the boldest strategists had not anticipated on the scale that would unfold. And this late yet decisive entry completely altered the international balance because, until then, the United Kingdom had been resisting the Axis almost alone in Europe, while the Soviet Union endured the Nazi storm on the Eastern Front. But from December 1941 onward, a new element emerged, an industrial giant awakening not only with a thirst for revenge, but with the capacity to produce more ships than Japan could sink, more aircraft than the Luftwaffe could shoot down, and more ammunition than the Wehrmacht could expend. And this colossal industrial surge would become a historical record, with shipyards launching entire aircraft carriers in time frames that once would have taken years, factories converting automobiles into tanks and bombers, and women entering the workforce en masse for the first time, resulting in profound social transformations that would also shape the post-war world. Meanwhile, Japan watched its initial victories with optimism, capturing Hong Kong, advancing into the Philippines, and seizing territories across Southeast Asia at a pace that led many to believe the Japanese Empire was unstoppable. But that confidence did not last long, because when the American counterattack began, it came with force and strategy, and it is impossible to speak of Pearl Harbor without mentioning Midway, the battle that took place just 6 months later and changed the course of the war in the Pacific, destroying 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and permanently overturning the balance of power. Yet while we analyze the great battles, we cannot forget that Pearl Harbor left human and emotional wounds that did not disappear with the end of the war. Because every sunken ship represented interrupted lives, families who received telegrams bearing short and devastating messages, mothers who preserved uniforms and photographs as relics, and survivors who carried trauma for the rest of their lives, many of them recalling how the smell of smoke, burning oil, and hot metal never left their memory. And the cultural impact was not long in coming, as Pearl Harbor became a symbol of vigilance, patriotism, and also extreme suspicion, which tragically led to the unjust imprisonment of more than 110,000 Japanese Americans in internment camps under accusations of national security risk, a dark chapter that demonstrates how fear, when combined with power, can generate profound injustices even in nations that claim to defend freedom. And when the conflict finally ended in 1945, with Japan devastated and Germany defeated, it was impossible to look back and not see an entire path traced from that Sunday. Because if Pearl Harbor had not happened in the brutal and unexpected way it did, perhaps the United States would not have entered the war so early, perhaps the Axis would have consolidated stronger positions, and perhaps the post-war map of the world would have been entirely different. And this is why historians always return to that date, because it is not merely a military event, but a geopolitical trigger that redefined alliances, accelerated technologies, transformed industries, changed society, and inaugurated the age of superpowers, an era in which the United States emerged as a global leader, and in which the reconstruction of Japan would become one of the most unexpected stories in international politics, transforming a defeated militarist empire into a peaceful technological and economic powerhouse in the decades that followed. And today, when we visit the USS Arizona Memorial, where part of the ship still rests beneath the water and small bubbles of oil continue to rise after more than 8 decades, we feel a kind of heavy, symbolic silence, because that oil reaching the surface is like a testimony that history is still breathing there, reminding us that hundreds of young men continue to rest inside that hull, and that behind speeches, strategies, and battles, there are always lives, faces, and destinies that must never be reduced to numbers. And for this reason, Pearl Harbor continues to be remembered every year not only as a military milestone, but as a human and universal memorial. And for those who study the attack through a strategic lens, Pearl Harbor remains a permanent lesson in intelligence, preparation, and surprise, because it proved that no nation is immune to vulnerability, that technological superiority can collapse in the face of unexpected strategies, and that decisions made in offices, both in Japan and in the United States, have the power to shape entire continents. And if there is one definitive lesson Pearl Harbor teaches us, it is that history is not born only in great congresses, treaties, and speeches. It is also born on sunny Sundays that suddenly turn into scenes of war, and that what we believe to be distant can cross oceans in a matter of minutes. So when we look back and revisit that December 7th, 1941, we understand that the phrase "a day that will live in infamy," spoken by President Franklin Roosevelt, was not merely patriotic rhetoric. It was a precise description of how that event would echo across generations. Therefore, if you have made it this far and want to continue exploring hidden stories, strategic backrooms, and the individuals who changed the world, I invite you to go beyond this narrative and dive even deeper into this chapter of the Second World War, because to understand Pearl Harbor is to understand part of the construction of the modern world. And if you enjoy narrative historical content like this, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell, because that helps the project grow and allows me to bring you more powerful, human, and intense stories like this one. And now I want to hear from you. What historical topic would you like to see next on the channel? Leave your comment below.